The bell rang sharply, signaling the start of another school day. In Mrs. Carter's advanced literature class, students hurried to their seats, opening their books as the stern teacher walked in. She carried herself with the kind of authority that demanded respect, her sharp gaze scanning the room for any sign of distraction. As she set down her papers, her eyes settled on Jamal, the only black student in the class who sat quietly at his desk, already flipping through the assigned reading. "Jamal," she called out, her voice laced with impatience. "Why are you always so slow? Do you even bother to prepare for my lessons?" A few students exchanged nervous glances, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Jamal looked up, his expression calm but guarded. "I read the chapter last night, Mrs. Carter," he replied evenly. Mrs. Carter scoffed. "Then perhaps you can explain the symbolism in the first passage?" She folded her arms, her tone challenging. Jamal took a deep breath, knowing that no matter what he said, she would find a way to undermine him. But he refused to let her see him falter. The class watched in silence, sensing the tension growing in the air. Jamal took a steady breath and began explaining the passage, carefully choosing his words. "The author uses the storm to symbolize inner conflict." Mrs. Carter cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Wrong. Completely off. Did you even think before speaking?" Her words stung, and a few students lowered their heads, unwilling to meet Jamal's eyes. Jamal clenched his fists under the desk but remained composed. He knew this wasn't about his answer. It never was. He had seen her overlook mistakes from other students, even praise half-baked responses, but with him she always found a reason to criticize. "Can anyone else save us from this nonsense?" she scoffed, scanning the room. A girl hesitantly raised her hand and gave a similar explanation, but this time Mrs. Carter nodded approvingly. "See? That's how you analyze literature, Jamal. Pay attention next time." The humiliation settled in Jamal's chest like a weight, but he refused to react. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. As the class moved on, he sat in silence, determined not to let her break him. But deep down he wondered how much longer he could endure this. As the class ended, students hurriedly packed their bags, eager to escape the tense atmosphere. Jamal moved slower, gathering his things while the whispers around him grew. He knew what they were about. Some pitied him, while others were simply relieved it hadn't been them on the receiving end of Mrs. Carter's scorn. Ryan, Mrs. Carter's son, stood by the door, watching with a conflicted expression. Unlike his mother, he had always been friendly to Jamal, but he never spoke up when she targeted him. Now, as Jamal passed by, Ryan hesitated before saying, "Hey man, you okay?" Jamal met his gaze, appreciating the concern but also knowing that words without action meant little. "Yeah, I'm good," he replied with a small nod before walking past him. Ryan frowned, watching Jamal leave. He had seen his mother's behavior before but had always ignored it, justifying it as her being strict. But today, something about the way she had torn into Jamal didn't sit right with him. He wondered, if this was how she treated him in class, what else had she done when no one was watching? Days passed, and Mrs. Carter's treatment of Jamal only worsened. Every small mistake became an opportunity for humiliation. If his handwriting was slightly messy, she'd call it sloppy in front of the class. If he hesitated before answering a question, she'd roll her eyes and sigh loudly. One afternoon, while handing back essays, she deliberately placed Jamal's paper face up on his desk. A large red D was scrawled across the top, and beneath it she had written, "Disappointing. Do better." The class fell into an uneasy silence as Jamal stared at the page. He knew he had worked hard on this paper, yet Mrs. Carter barely glanced at his work before grading. Ryan, sitting a few rows away, noticed. He had seen his mother be tough on students before, but this was different. It was personal. His jaw clenched as he watched Jamal take a deep breath, straighten his shoulders, and quietly tuck the paper into his folder. As class ended, Ryan stayed behind, his voice firm as he approached his mother. "Mom, that wasn't fair." Mrs. Carter gave him a sharp look. "Excuse me? You're always picking on Jamal," he said. "Everyone sees it." She scoffed, shaking her head. "I treat all my students the same." Ryan wasn't convinced. And for the first time he wasn't sure if he could stay silent much longer. Jamal walked through the crowded hallway, his grip tightening on the essay in his folder. He tried to shake off the frustration, but Mrs. Carter's words clung to him like a weight he couldn't drop. He had worked hard on that assignment, staying up late to perfect every detail. Yet, no matter how much effort he put in, it was never enough for her. As he reached his locker, his best friend, Malik, leaned against it, already sensing something was wrong. "She on your case again?" Malik asked, his tone laced with irritation. Jamal let out a small, humorless chuckle. When is she not? Malik sighed. Man, it's like she's got a personal problem with you. You ever think about telling someone? Jamal hesitated. He had thought about it. But Mrs. Carter was a respected teacher. Who would believe him? And even if they did, what would change? It's whatever, Jamal muttered. I'm used to it. But Ryan, standing nearby, overheard their conversation. He frowned, his mother's words replaying in his head. She doesn't treat all her students the same, she treats Jamal worse. For the first time, Ryan realized silence wasn't enough. He had to do something. But how? The tension between Mrs. Carter and Jamal reached its peak during a school assembly. The auditorium buzzed with energy as students settled into their seats, the principal preparing to give a speech about academic excellence. Mrs. Carter stood near the stage, arms crossed, scanning the crowd like a hawk. Then she spotted Jamal. Jamal, she called out, her voice echoing through the microphone. Conversations died down as all eyes turned toward him. He hesitated before standing, his heart pounding. Mrs. Carter gave him a tight-lipped smile, but there was no kindness in it. Since you seem to struggle with basic effort in my class, why don't you explain to everyone here why academic discipline is so important? Her tone was condescending and laughter rippled through the crowd. Jamal felt the heat rise to his face. This wasn't about teaching, it was about humiliation. He swallowed hard, gripping the edges of his sweatshirt. Ryan, sitting a few rows back, stiffened. He had been wrestling with what to do for days, but seeing his mother publicly shame Jamal like this, he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. As the room waited for Jamal to respond, Ryan stood up. Loudly. Confidently. That's enough, Mom. Gasps filled the auditorium. Mrs. Carter's face drained of color. The entire school turned to Ryan, stunned by his defiance. Jamal's breath caught. For the first time, someone was standing up for him, and it was the last person he expected. Silence hung thick in the auditorium, the weight of Ryan's words shocking everyone, including Mrs. Carter. Her son had never challenged her before, certainly not in front of an audience. She cleared her throat, attempting to regain control. Ryan, sit down. This is not your place. But Ryan didn't back down. He stepped forward, his voice steady. No, Mom. It is my place. Because I've watched you single Jamal out over and over again. You act like he's not good enough, like he doesn't belong here. And it's wrong. A hushed murmur spread through the crowd. Students exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. Even a few teachers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly forced to acknowledge what had been happening all along. Jamal stood frozen, his heart pounding. No one had ever spoken up for him like this. Mrs. Carter's face twisted in frustration, her grip tightening on the microphone. Ryan, will discuss this later. But Ryan wasn't finished. He turned to the students. How many of you have seen this happen? How many of you knew it was wrong but stayed quiet? Hands hesitantly began to rise, first a few, then more. The truth was unraveling in front of everyone, and Mrs. Carter could no longer ignore it. For the first time in her career, she felt something she never expected, powerless. Mrs. Carter's fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the microphone, but she masked her unease with anger. This is completely inappropriate, she snapped. We do not disrespect teachers in this school. Ryan shook his head. Respect is earned, Mom. And right now you're not showing any. His words cut deep, echoing through the silent auditorium. Jamal looked around, stunned. He had spent years enduring Mrs. Carter's mistreatment, but he had never imagined this moment. Her authority being questioned, not by a fellow student or teacher, but by her own son. Principal Howard, who had been observing from the side of the stage, finally stepped forward. That's enough, he said, his voice firm but calm. Ryan, take your seat. Mrs. Carter, I'd like a word with you after the assembly. A flicker of panic crossed Mrs. Carter's face, but she quickly composed herself. Of course, she muttered, stepping back. Jamal exhaled, his hands still clenched at his sides. He had been ready to endure yet another public humiliation, but Ryan had changed everything. As the assembly continued, students whispered amongst themselves, their eyes darting between Ryan and Jamal. Something had shifted. A wall had cracked, and Mrs. Carter's iron grip over her classroom, and her son, was slipping. Ryan sat down beside Jamal, offering him a nod of quiet solidarity. Jamal didn't speak, but he didn't have to. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. The assembly ended, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air like an unshakable storm cloud. As students shuffled out of the auditorium, murmurs and whispers filled the halls. Mrs. Carter avoided eye contact with anyone, her mind racing. She had spent years establishing herself as a respected educator. How could her own son undermine her in front of the entire school? Ryan walked beside Jamal, ignoring the stares and murmurs. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Jamal nodded hesitantly. "I don't know what to say. No one's ever stood up for me like that before." Ryan gave him a small smile. "Well, someone should have a long time ago." Meanwhile, Principal Howard led Mrs. Carter into his office, shutting the door behind them. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Mrs. Carter, I don't need to tell you how serious this is. A student openly accused you of discrimination, your own son no less. This isn't something I can ignore." Mrs. Carter bristled. With all due respect, Ryan was out of line. "He embarrassed me in front of the entire school." Principal Howard folded his arms. "That's not the issue here. The issue is whether or not there's truth to what he said." He met her gaze firmly. "Have you been unfair to Jamal?" Mrs. Carter hesitated for the first time. I expect high standards from all my students." "High standards or higher for certain students?" Principal Howard pressed. For the first time, Mrs. Carter didn't have a response. The room was stifling, and she suddenly felt as if the walls were closing in. She had never doubted her authority before, but now she could feel the foundation of her reputation crumbling beneath her feet. Mrs. Carter sat stiffly in the principal's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of Principal Howard's words pressed down on her like a boulder. She had always prided herself on being a strict but fair teacher. At least that's what she told herself. But now, with her own son publicly condemning her actions, she was being forced to confront something she had never admitted before. "Mrs. Carter," Principal Howard continued, his voice steady but firm. "We can't ignore this. The students heard Ryan's accusations, and frankly, so did I. There have been complaints in the past, but this makes it impossible to brush aside." She stiffened. "Complaints?" Howard sighed, pulling out a folder from his desk. "Parents, students. Some have expressed concerns about how you treat certain students differently." He flipped through the pages before glancing at her. "Most notably Jamal." Mrs. Carter's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to keep her face neutral. "I hold all my students to the same expectations." Howard's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Really? Because from where I stand, it seems like you push some harder than others, and not in a way that helps them grow." For the first time in her career, Mrs. Carter felt powerless. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in on her. Meanwhile, outside the office, Jamal sat on a bench in the hallway, his fingers nervously tapping against his knee. Ryan sat beside him, offering silent support. "She's not going to get away with this, right?" Jamal finally asked. Ryan exhaled. "I don't know, man. But I promise you this. I won't let her." Jamal studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. Instead, he saw something rare, genuine determination. For the first time, Jamal felt like someone truly had his back. News of the assembly spread like wildfire throughout the school. Students whispered in the hallways, teachers exchanged uncertain glances, and even the administrative staff seemed on edge. Mrs. Carter, once seen as one of the most respected teachers, now walked the halls with a noticeable tension in her posture. She could feel the stares, hear the hushed conversations that abruptly stopped when she passed by. Jamal, on the other hand, found himself in unfamiliar territory. For years he had felt invisible, either overlooked or ridiculed. Now, students who had never spoken to him before approached him with quiet words of support. "Hey man, I saw what happened. That was messed up," one student murmured. Another gave him a nod of respect. Jamal wasn't sure how to feel about the sudden shift, but a part of him felt lighter. Ryan, however, faced a storm of his own. At home, the tension between him and his mother was unbearable. "How could you do that to me?" Mrs. Carter snapped, pacing the living room as Ryan sat calmly on the couch. "You humiliated me in front of the entire school." Ryan met her gaze evenly. "No, Mom. You humiliated yourself." His voice was firm, unwavering. "I just made sure everyone saw the truth." Mrs. Carter's hands clenched into fists. "I was trying to teach discipline, to prepare students for the real world. But of course you don't understand that." Ryan scoffed. "No, what you were doing was tearing someone down because of your own bias. And the worst part? You didn't even realize it until you got called out." His mother's face twisted with anger, but beneath it there was something else, discomfort. A creeping realization that, deep down, she knew he wasn't entirely wrong. Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Ryan finally stood, shaking his head. I don't know if you'll ever admit it, but you were wrong. And now everyone knows. As he walked away, Mrs. Carter remained still, staring at the floor, her mind swirling with thoughts she had never dared to face before. The next morning, Mrs. Carter walked into the school with her head held high, but deep down she felt the weight of judgment pressing on her. The usual respect she commanded from students and teachers had vanished. Instead, there were whispers, lingering stares, and a silence that spoke louder than words. Even the principal had called her in for a meeting, one she knew wouldn't go in her favor. Jamal entered the classroom hesitantly, expecting another tense lesson under Mrs. Carter's rule. But for the first time she didn't meet his eyes. There was no sharp insult, no unnecessary criticism. She simply moved through the lesson, her voice lacking its usual confidence. The students could feel the shift in power. The authority she had wielded for years had crumbled in an instant. Meanwhile, Ryan was dealing with his own fallout. Some of his friends supported him, but others questioned why he would publicly humiliate his own mother. "Dude, that was intense," one classmate said as they sat in the cafeteria. "I mean, I get it, but that's your mom." Ryan sighed, rubbing his temple. "Yeah, and that's exactly why I had to say something," he replied. "She was wrong. And if I let it slide just because she's my mom, then I'd be no better than her." As much as Ryan stood by his decision, part of him couldn't shake the guilt. At home, his mother barely spoke to him. The walls between them had never felt so thick. He had wanted to wake her up to the reality of her actions, but instead, he had shattered the relationship they once had. That afternoon, Mrs. Carter sat in the principal's office, her hands folded in her lap. Principal Reynolds sighed, leaning forward. "Mrs. Carter, this isn't just about a single incident. We've received complaints from multiple students over the years. This assembly incident was just the final straw." Mrs. Carter stiffened. "I was enforcing discipline," she insisted, her voice defensive. The principal shook his head. "No. You were targeting a student unfairly. And now the entire school knows it." She swallowed hard. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just dealing with temporary embarrassment. Her career, her reputation, and everything she had built were on the line. That evening, the Carter household was eerily silent. Ryan sat at the dinner table, pushing his food around his plate, while his mother sat across from him, barely touching her meal. His father, Mr. Carter, cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "So, this is how it's going to be now. No one's going to talk?" he asked, looking between them. Mrs. Carter finally set her fork down with a sigh. "What is there to say?" she muttered. "My own son humiliated me in front of the entire school." Ryan met her gaze without flinching. "You humiliated yourself, Mom," he said firmly. "I just told the truth." His mother's lips tightened. "You don't understand. I was trying to discipline a student, to push him to do better." Ryan scoffed. "No, you were tearing him down. There's a difference." Mr. Carter rubbed his temples. "Enough," he said. "This isn't just about what happened at school. This is about what kind of people we choose to be. And honestly, I'm disappointed. Not in Ryan, but in you, Linda." Mrs. Carter's eyes widened. "You're taking his side?" "I'm taking the side of what's right," he said, his voice tired. "You were wrong, and it's time you faced that." Mrs. Carter's hands trembled in her lap. She had spent her life earning the respect of her peers, maintaining control over her classroom, and believing in her authority. But now, even her own family was telling her that she had crossed the line. Ryan pushed back his chair. "I don't regret what I did," he said, standing up. "And I'd do it again if I had to." Without another word, he left the table, leaving his mother sitting there, stunned and more alone than ever. Mrs. Carter sat alone in the dimly lit living room, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. The events of the past few days played in her mind like a broken record. Her harsh words to Jamal, the stunned silence of the students, and worst of all, Ryan's public defiance. She had always prided herself on being a disciplined, no-nonsense educator. But now, for the first time, she questioned whether her version of discipline had turned into cruelty. The way Jamal looked at her, his quiet endurance in the face of her unfairness, haunted her. She had justified her actions, believing she was toughening him up for the real world. But had she simply been tearing him down? Her husband's words echoed in her ears. "You were wrong, and it's time you faced that." Taking a deep breath, she reached for her laptop and searched Jamal's student records. His grades were exceptional, his attendance perfect. There was no logical reason for the way she had treated him, only her own bias, something she had never admitted to herself before. The truth was bitter, but it was there. She had been unfair. She had let prejudice dictate her actions. And now she had to decide what to do about it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she finally started typing. A message. A request for a meeting. A step toward making things right. For the first time in a long time, Mrs. Carter felt uncertain. But deep down she knew that change had to start with her. The next morning, Mrs. Carter stood outside the principal's office, her heart pounding. She had requested a private meeting with Jamal, and now that the moment had arrived, she wasn't sure if she was ready. Apologizing was never something she had done easily, especially not to a student. When the door opened, Jamal stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He stood tall, not with defiance but with quiet dignity. Principal Reynolds sat at his desk, observing silently as Mrs. Carter took a deep breath. "Jamal," she started, folding her hands together, "I asked you here because I owe you an apology." Jamal's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he remained silent, waiting. She exhaled, feeling the weight of her own words. "I was wrong. I treated you unfairly. And I see that now." She looked him in the eyes, forcing herself to confront the damage she had done. "You are an excellent student, and I should have encouraged you instead of tearing you down." Jamal studied her for a long moment. "Why now?" he asked. "Because Ryan spoke up?" Mrs. Carter swallowed. "Because I finally opened my eyes," she admitted. "Ryan's words made me reflect, but the truth is, I should have seen it on my own. I should have been better." There was another long pause. Then, slowly, Jamal nodded. "I appreciate the apology," he said, his voice calm. "But respect isn't just given. It's shown." Mrs. Carter felt a lump in her throat. She had spent years demanding respect from her students without realizing that she had never truly earned it. "I understand," she said sincerely. "And I will do better." As Jamal left the office, Mrs. Carter remained seated, staring at the empty chair across from her. The apology had been difficult, but the real work was just beginning. It wasn't about words, it was about change. And for the first time in her career, she was ready to learn.